What is going on, everyone? This is Eric coming at you from just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. And today, we're going to look at the Randy Johnson trade, which occurred back on May 25th, 1989. Now, last week, I released the player bio of Randy Johnson. And during that player bio, I remembered the trade that the Seattle Mariners made to get him. And at that time, in 1989, this was a big trade. More because they were giving away Mark Langston. So I decided, what would be a good idea? Let's go into detail in that trade. So without further ado, let's go right ahead and start discussing the Randy Johnson trade, which was a swapping of 5 players between the Seattle Mariners and the then Montreal Expos. So we'll start by looking at Seattle. Now the first player, of course, that they got was starting pitcher Randy Johnson. Now I'm not going to go into complete and full detail on his stats just because we had the player about to do that in. But I'm still going to discuss certain things, of course. Now, he had a rough finish to the 1989 season, but that was always somewhat to be expected. It was clear that he had massive talent, though. Now, by the 1990 season, there were some rough edges that he had to smooth out, but he did throw a no-hitter on June 2nd, 1990. He ended that season with a league-leading 120 walks, though. Now, he once again led the league in walks in 1991, and for the third year in a row in 1992. He also led the league in strikeouts in 92, but he led the league in hit by pitches as well that year. At this point, though, it was clear that he had a lot of upside and a lot of potential. Now, at the end of the 92 season, he had a discussion with Nolan Ryan. And Nolan Ryan, who's a similar pitcher to Randy Johnson, helped Johnson improve. And the results were almost immediate. In 1993, Randy Johnson broke out in a huge way as he recorded 308 strikeouts to 99 walks. He had another very strong season during the strike-shortened campaign of 1994. Now, his best year as a Mariner came in 1995, when he pitched to the tune of an 18-2 record with a league-leading 294 strikeouts and a league-leading ERA at 2.48. He also won the AL Cy Young Award for his efforts. Now, he was solid in 1996, but he didn't play all that much due to a back injury. He rebounded with a very strong campaign in 1997 that saw him go 20-4. He started off the 98 season a bit slowly, as he had a 4.33 earned run average through 23 starts, but at that point, he was traded. Now, he was traded in part just because they weren't going to give him a contract. He wanted a contract extension to stay in Seattle. Seattle was a smaller market team. They didn't think they'd be able to pay him what he was owed, so they decided to trade him. Still, though, his time in Seattle was great. He was a 5-time All-Star. He had his first career no-hitter. He was also a 1-time AL Cy Young winner. He led the league in strikeouts 4 times. He led the league in ERA 1 time. And he is a member of both the MLB Baseball Hall of Fame as well as the Seattle Mariners Hall of Fame. Now, of course, there are other things too, like that. He led the league in walks 3 times and hit by pitches once, but those aren't good accolades to remember him for. Now, he was traded to the Houston Astros in exchange for 3 assets. The first we're going to look at is starting pitcher Freddie Garcia. Now, Freddie Garcia had a strong rookie year, and he followed it up with a somewhat average season in 2000. Now, he had a career year in 2001, as he managed to lead the American League in ERA at 3.05 and innings pitched, en route to an 18-6 record. Now, he would regress a bit in 2002, and a little bit more in 2003. And then he ends up getting traded midway through the 2004 season. Now, he had an overall record of 76-50 with a 3.89 ERA. He was a 2-time All-Star, and he led the AL in ERA 1 time. It's a pretty solid pickup. Now, he's traded to the Chicago White Sox in exchange for 3 assets. So the first we're going to look at is utility man Michael Morse. So Michael Morse, he would deal with various injuries over his 4 years in Seattle. He would appear in 107 games over that time frame. And he did hit 300, showing potential, but the defense wasn't that great, and they didn't have a role for him, so they would trade him to the Washington Nationals. Now, I have a star by the Nationals. We'll get to that when we get to the Nationals. But in exchange for Morse, Seattle would get outfielder Ryan Langerhans. And Langerhans, he spent parts of 3 seasons bouncing between the majors and the minors. He was more a platoon bat at the major league level, though. He never really got a starting job. he would hit the Mendoza line at 200 over 117 games for the team, and then he would end up getting traded away for cash. We're not going to discuss that trade because it's just not worth discussing. Now, back to this Freddie Garcia trade. Seattle still got a pair of assets in this deal. The next one we're going to look at is catcher Miguel Oliva. Now, Oliva hit just below the Mendoza line for just 1 calendar year, so half a season and then half a season before he himself was shipped away to the San Diego Padres in exchange for a pair of assets. A lot of deals here. The first one we're going to look at is another catcher named Miguel Ojeda. Now, he would hit a .172 over a half season, but his offense wasn't a strong suit. He was a very good defensive catcher, so that's what salvaged his time frame in Seattle that half year. Now, they also got relief pitcher Nathaniel Mateo, and he did not end up making it above high A for the organization. Now, the last asset that Seattle got in exchange from the White Sox for Freddie Garcia was outfielder Jeremy Reed. Now, Jeremy Reed, when he was healthy and in the majors, was one of the better defensive center fielders in the league. He would appear in 336 games at the MLB level for the Mariners when he hit .257, so decent, with 12 homers. But by the time Ichiro came to the team, he would take the starting center field job just because his bat was that much better, which ended up pushing Reed to the minors. Now, he ends up getting traded. We are not going to be discussing that trade because that will be its own video in the future, the JJ Putz trade. Stay tuned for that. So that discusses Freddie Garcia. Let's go back to the trade where the Mariners traded away Randy Johnson because there's still 2 assets to look at. The next one we have to look at is shortstop Carlos Guillen. Now, Guillen would bounce between the minors and the majors for his first 2 years in Seattle. Now, he ends up becoming a platoon bat in year 3, so at least he's on the Major League roster. But the next 3 years, so his 4th, 5th, and 6th years, he became a solid starter in Seattle. Now, all said and done, over 488 games, he would hit .264 with 29 homers before he was traded to the Detroit Tigers in exchange for a pair of infield prospects. The first one we're going to look at is Ramon Santiago. Now, he would spend most of his 2-year stint in Seattle in the minors, but he was solid in the minors. Although being good in the minors isn't necessarily the best thing for the parent club. Now, he still was okay, but the team just didn't seem to think his skills would transfer to the majors, and they never really did when he was called up, so he ends up getting released. Now, they also got infielder Juan Gonzalez, and he would bounce around the minors for a few years before he was released, never making it up to the MLB for the team. Now, the last asset that the Mariners got in exchange for Randy Johnson was pitcher John Halama. And Halama, he was a solid pitcher for 4 years in Seattle. Over that time, he would pitch a 41-31 record with a 4.46 ERA and 312 strikeouts, 171 walks, over 557 innings pitched. And then he would walk. So all in all, not a bad haul to get for a rental player. But we'll get to Houston in a minute. Now there's still 2 more players we have to look at from the Seattle Mariners perspective. And those are the 2 players that they got from Montreal alongside Randy Johnson. So the next one we're going to look at is starting pitcher Brian Holman. Now Holman, over 2.5 years, he compiled a 32-35 record with a 3.73 ERA. He essentially had to stop playing due to an arm injury. He probably could have gotten another couple years with the team, but unfortunately, an injury made him essentially have to retire. Now, the last player that they got was relief pitcher Gene Harris. Now, Harris was far from effective over parts of 4 years in Seattle. He had a 5.48 ERA over that time. Now, he began as a starter, but he made most of his appearances for the team in the bullpen, and then he would be traded away to the San Diego Padres in exchange for outfielder Will Taylor. Now, Taylor would only spend a year in the minors before he walked. We're finally done with the Seattle Mariners side of this deal. How did the Montreal Expos do? So, Montreal got a pair of players from Seattle in this deal. A pair of pitchers, I should say. The first one is starting pitcher Mark Langston. Now, Langston, he went 12-9 with a 2.39 ERA over a half season, but he would walk as a free agent. So, not the best for them to get him just to see him walk. Now, they also got starting pitcher Mike Campbell. Did he salvage the trade? Unfortunately, he would spend a half season in the minors before he himself was traded to the Chicago White Sox in exchange for second baseman, third baseman Robert Fletcher. Now Fletcher, he would spend a single year in the minors before walking. So now we have to look at the secondary teams because there's a clear winner in the primary teams. The first secondary team we're going to look at is the Washington Nationals. Now, if you're a baseball fan, you're aware that the Montreal Expos moved to Washington in the early mid-2000s. So I'm just going to include them in the total war for Washington, for Montreal. So they got outfielder Michael Morse. At this point in his career, he had shifted to being mostly an outfielder. So that's why we have him listed as outfielder instead of utility here. Now, he managed to stay relatively healthy in Washington, as he would play in 378 games over 4 years. Now, he was more of a reserve player over that time, though. He did hit .294 with 67 homers. Now, he ends up getting traded, but we're not going to be discussing that because in this part of the trade, I guess you can say Nationals or Expos are considered a secondary team, so we will not be following that trade. So, next we have the Houston Astros, who would acquire starting pitcher Randy Johnson. Now, Johnson had a very strong half season in Houston. He had a 10-1 record with a 1.28 ERA. Amazing. Now, he also would finish 7th place in the NL Cy Young voting, despite only playing 11 games in the NL that year. That's how dominant he was. It was amazing. Now, he was solid in the postseason, but the team literally gave him no run support, and then he would walk as a free agent. If you're curious about that, the Randy Johnson trade or the Randy Johnson player about is recently out. Check that out. Same thing with even the Houston Astros franchise history of that does discuss Randy Johnson as well. So next we have the Chicago White Sox. So the White Sox were a part of two separate trades. The first of which saw them get 2 players, and the first of those players, was starting pitcher Freddie Garcia. Now, the change of scenery helped Garcia, who had a strong 2.5-year tenure in Chicago. He was a member of the curse-breaking 2005 team. Now, after those 2.5 years, he would get traded. We will not be discussing that. In this trade, Chicago also got catcher Ben Davis. Now, Ben Davis would hit .231 in a platoon role for half a season before he walked. Now, the other trade that the White Sox were a part of saw them get starting pitcher Mike Campbell from Montreal. And he would get released after a half season in the minors, so not much to talk about there. The next team we're going to look at is the San Diego Padres. So they were also a part of 2 separate trades, the first of which saw them get catcher Miguel Olivo, and he would hit .304 in a part-time role for a half season before he would walk as a free agent. The second deal saw them get relief pitcher Gene Harris, and Harris played decently in San Diego. He had a 3.68 ERA. Now, he would spend some time as a closer, but due to injuries, he would lose his job to Trevor Hoffman, who obviously made a very good name for himself. Now, he would get traded after Hoffman proved that he could handle the role. We will not be discussing that trade. Now, the last team that we're going to look at is the Detroit Tigers, who got shortstop Carlos Gilliam, and he immediately broke out in his new city, but he would tear his ACL late in his first year as a Tiger. A hamstring injury slowed him down in year 2 as he was surprisingly able to recover from that torn ACL and return in time for year 2. Now, he would have a career year in 2006 as he would hit .320. His next 2 years were very strong as well, as he hit a combined .292 with 31 homers. Now, his last 3 years in Detroit were not the best, but he did deal with various injuries which slowed him down. However, he was still a valuable piece for that team. He would walk after 8 years with the team, but he was a 3-time All-Star. So now we have the fun part, the wars. Who won this trade? I don't even think I really have to say all that much for who won. Seattle got an 80 WAR out of all their players. Randy Johnson was one of the best players in baseball in the 90s, arguably the best pitcher in baseball in the 90s. I don't even know if there's a real debate to that. Definitely the best pitcher that was not in Atlanta in the 90s. So this was a great deal for them. Montreal/Washington. So, I mean, it's kind of up in the air, but they got a combined 10.5 WAR for their players. But really, it wasn't the best. It's mostly Michael Morse and Mark Langston. But they definitely regretted this trade. There's no denying it. Now, the other teams that were involved, Houston got a 4.3 out of Randy Johnson. Chicago got a 9.1 out of their 3 players. So San Diego got a 1.8 out of their 2 players. And lastly, Detroit got an 18.6. So this was definitely one of those fun trades where there was a lot to talk about. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know it's one of the longer videos, but this was the Randy Johnson trade breakdown. If you are interested, check out the player bio that we released last week. Have a good rest of your day.